which we jointly organized with CSEPs in Delhi and the International Monetary Fund here. My name is Anne-Marie Goulde. I'm Deputy Director of the Fund's Asia and Pacific Department, overseeing the work on India. As we all know, the economic and social impact of COVID-19 in India has been substantial. In the aftermath of the initial shock, fiscal support has played a critical role in saving lives and livelihood and prevented more severe economic contractions. At the same time, fiscal deficits have increased and public debt levels have reached almost 100% of GDP globally. Rising public debt has further reduced fiscal space, while the full impact of the crisis on corporate balance sheets and the health of the financial system are still largely unknown. COVID-19 has also had considerable social implications, disproportionately affecting contact-sensitive and informal sectors, low-income households, women, and micro and small and medium-sized enterprises. The latest and unfortunately still ongoing surge in new cases in India and in other parts of the world is a stark reminder that there is significant uncertainty about the path of the pandemic and the economic recovery. So while public debt levels increased at the global level and in India, we see continued policy support as critical until the COVID-19 shocks are contained and the recovery is well entrenched. In this context, enhancing near-term fiscal space while securing sustainable fiscal finances in the medium term has emerged as a key policy priority. We are therefore extremely pleased to bring together a very distinguished group of international and India experts to facilitate an exchange of ideas on the role of medium-term fiscal frameworks and strategies to enhance fiscal space to address current spending needs while ensuring sustainable finances. The aim is to bring in both the international experience and discuss its relevance for India, as well as strategy that could facilitate application. Today's speakers are, of course, well known to most of you, and you all have their full and detailed bios in the invitation. But let me briefly introduce them to you following the order in which they appear in the agenda. To start with Vitor Gaspar, who is director of our Fiscal Affairs Department of the International Monetary Fund. Prior to joining the IMF, Mr. Gaspar was in several senior positions.
I can now hear. I think the audio level in the computer was very low.
That is very good. Great. So continuing with Mr. Gaspar, he had several senior positions at the Banco de Portugal. He, of course, also served as Minister of State and Finance of Portugal. He headed the European Commission's Bureau of Economic Policy Advisors and was Director General of Research at the European Central Bank. Moving on to Mr. N.K. Singh, who is the chairman of the 15th Finance Commission. Previously, Mr. Singh was chairman of the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Review Committee. He also served as a member of the Upper House of Parliament during 2008 to 2014. Prior to his entry into politics, Mr. Singh had a distinguished career as a member of the Indian Administrative Service, including as Expenditure Secretary, Revenue Secretary, Secretary to the Prime Minister of India, and member of the Planning Commission, among other functions. Mr. Niels Thyssen, Professor Niels Thyssen, is chairman of the European Fiscal Board and Professor Emeritus of International Economics at the University of Copenhagen. Professor Thyssen's research and publication have focused on European monetary and financial integration, and while holding a chair at the University of Copenhagen, he has also served as advisor to the governor of Denmark's National Bank, as co-chair of the Danish Economic Council, and member of various expert groups and committees, including the Delors Committee. Mr. Montek Singh Alwalia is a distinguished fellow at CSEPs and a member of the board of the Council for Energy, Environment and Water in New Delhi. Mr. Alwalia was the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission of the Republic of India and director of the Independent Evaluation Office here at the IMF. He has been a key figure in the Indian economic reform process from the mid-1980s and has held many senior leadership roles in government. Mr. Anup Singh is Distinguished Fellow at CSEPs and a member of the 15th Finance Commission, and he has kindly agreed to moderate today's roundtable. Mr. Singh has been adjunct professor at Georgetown University since 2015. And he has served in senior leadership roles in various academic, financial, and international institutions. Of course, to us, he is best known as having served as the director to 3 departments in the IMF, the ASEAN Pacific Department, the Western Hemisphere Department, and the Special Operations. Mr. Rakesh Mohan is the president and distinguished fellow at CSEPs, and he has kindly agreed to provide closing remarks for the roundtable. Mr. Mohan was previously senior fellow in the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs and professor at the School of Management at Yale University. Closely associated with Indian economic reforms, with the Indian economic reform process from the late 1980s, he served in several senior roles in government, including as Secretary of Economic Affairs and Chief Economic Advisor of the Indian Ministry of Finance. He was also the Deputy Governor of the Reserve Bank and Executive Director on the board of the IMF. Without further ado, please let me turn over to Mr. Alfred Schipke. Alfred is the IMF's India Mission Chief, and he will give a short presentation to set the stage. I look forward to a very productive discussion and want to thank the distinguished speakers again for participating in our dialogue. Thank you. Alfred, over to you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. We're indeed very grateful to have this distinguished group to discuss a critical topic that is not only relevant for the medium term, but in the current context. Maybe we could bring up the slides. So what I'd like to do is just briefly set the stage, focusing initially on how we look at the growth, and then focus on the latest COVID surge, before then really zooming in on fiscal issues. Next. So we just a few weeks ago published our World Economic Outlook, and are suggesting that the global economy is recovering and on firmer ground. But we're also highlight that the recovery is divergent, so not all countries are the same, and that there are very, very large uncertainties. For the globe overall, we, after having seen a decline last year, we are now projecting 6% growth for this year. Now, compared to previous projections, we had upgraded our growth forecast, and part of that was actually driven by large fiscal support in some of the larger economies. For India, we are looking at a decline of output for the fiscal year that just finished in March of 8%, minus 8%, and are projecting a recovery of 12.5% for this fiscal year. But let me just say 2 or 3 things about our growth projections for this fiscal year. First, of course, This was done prior to the latest surge in COVID cases in India. But secondly, a large part of that is just a statistical phenomenon. It's what we call a carryover. 9.7% is just related to this particular carryover. Our projections do or did assume that there might be localized lockdowns. Next slide. Now, having said that, while we're looking at a global economy that continues to recover, we also need to keep in mind that there are potentially large scarring effects, meaning that the COVID shock does not only have had an impact currently, but that we're going to see the impact of that for the foreseeable future. What this figure tries to show is that if we were to look at how the global economy would have evolved prior to the crisis over a 5-year horizon, and we're looking at how we're looking at the economy now, we can see that for the global economy, even after 5 years, we would still be 3% lower. Now, for India, that is even larger, where the scarring effect are estimated to be 10%. Now, having said all of this, it is critically important to keep in mind that our projections in the current environment are highly uncertain and depend on many, many factors. Next slide. A critical factor is, of course, the path of the pandemic, both globally and for India. And what we have seen in India is, of course, disconcerting, because we have had a significant surge in daily new cases, which yesterday reached another high of about 300,000 on a daily basis. Now, initially, many of the surges were concentrated in one state, Maharashtra, but we do see now that cases are increasing in other states as well, and 10 states account for about 80% of all the new cases that we have seen. Now, that of course brings both social and economic hardship, and the question really is, what will this mean for the economy? And there are many aspects to it, but let me just highlight 3. One, of course, is how the pandemic will continue to evolve over time, so the path. The second one is the behavior of households, of investors, and then, of course, lastly, and we'll talk a little bit about that today, is government policies. While the data is still very limited because the COVID surge has only taken place over the last couple of weeks, but what is clear is that the downside risks have increased. And if we look at the data that is available, we do see that mobility within India has declined, and it has already had an impact on consumer confidence. For the IMF, we will update our forecast in June. Next slide. When we talk about the economic impact, I think it is critically important to think about the social consequences of this. And what the pandemic really has done, it has increased inequality and poverty globally. We estimate that globally, extreme poverty, so people that make less than $1.90 per day, has gone up by almost 100 million people. Now, a large part of that, 50% of it, 50 million people, are estimated to be in India. It's, of course, a large country. 22 million in sub-Saharan Africa. So these are really, really the social implications of the pandemic, and what it means, and related to today's topic again, the importance of continued fiscal support, especially to those who have been adversely impacted the most. Next, please. Now, India responded to the COVID shock on many levels: fiscal policy, monetary policy, and financial sector policy. When it comes to fiscal policy, the overall support we estimate has been about 8.4%. A large part of that, more than 5% of GDP, it was what we call below the line support, meaning in terms of government guarantees. Next slide. Now, India India announced a budget in February, and in our view, it rightly focuses on providing continued support to the economy, and in general, it was a growth enhancing budget. In our estimate, the overall fiscal stance would support growth by 0.6 percentage points. An important part of the budget also, and we might discuss that later on, is that it does focus on increased privatization. And I think this is the important part, because what it allows the government is to maybe shed itself of companies that are viable in the private sector, and instead use those resources for public investment, for example, where the private sector might not be as active. Next slide. Now, of course, because of the economic impact of the pandemic and the support that has been provided, the fiscal positions in most countries of the world have been deteriorated. Vito will talk more about that, but just want to highlight two things. First of all, we're now looking at debt to GDP ratios in India that reached about 90% by the end of last fiscal year. And we're also seeing that, of course, fiscal deficits have gone up significantly. More importantly, and that will be part of the discussion, is that public debt and fiscal deficits are significantly higher than the ceilings that are embedded in India's fiscal rules. Next slide. And here we actually borrowed a figure from the report of the 15th Finance Commission, because I think it does two things. First of all, it shows nicely what a modern financial architecture looks like, but it also has the pillars that will be part of the discussion that will follow, and that is the importance of fiscal rules, public financial management, and the institutional setting that supports that. Interestingly enough, these three pillars are also the areas where, especially our friends from the Fiscal Affairs Department, provide a lot of capacity development. Next slide. So let me finish by just proposing three kind of broader questions that maybe one could discuss. First of all, why the focus on medium-term fiscal frameworks at this juncture? And I think the key here is that it is a way to think about how to ensure that we can provide maximum fiscal support today, while not forgetting about a sustainability in the medium term. And what are some good principles and lessons from other countries in terms of how those frameworks should look like? And one part or one proposal is the role of fiscal councils. So I think these will be the topics that will guide our discussion later on. And with that, I'll pause, and maybe I'll pass on the baton to Anup Singh.
Alfred, thank you very much. Let me make a few points. It's certainly my great pleasure and honor to moderate this panel with four very distinguished panelists. I shouldn't say much more on them. Peter Gasper and Niels Thygesen bring to us unmatched global leadership and experience. Both have looked at the integration in Europe. Peter had just brought out the fiscal monitor and the new economic outlook. Just a few more words on NK and Montec. In a very simple way, you know that some years back, not that long ago, India was suddenly catapulted into becoming, for some time, the largest growing large economy in the world. We need to return to that. And you probably know that NK, call him NK, he was the architect of the 1991 reforms. And he has now produced a report that takes India through 2026. You know, obviously, Montec very well. What you may not know is that Montec, among his other positions, I think has been, am I right, Montec, the longest serving finance secretary India has had. I think between these two, India has done the reforms that made it for some time the fastest growing. Before turning the discussion over to them, let me just make a few points. As Alfred just said, we were just told by the IMF that we are now having quite a strong recovery. Even that it could be better than expected. However, the assessment makes the point, importantly, it is a very divergent recovery. My question, therefore, to the panelists is, can there be a sustainable global recovery without doing more globally to deal with the divergences and narrow them? My second point, divergences brings us to where India is now, India's current moment, in which India is facing, as Alfred said, an unprecedented second COVID shock. It therefore raises again the role fiscal policy needs to play in India and other similarly placed countries to ensure the COVID shocks are contained. On this issue, in this context, Vito Gaspar's fiscal monitor has rightly pointed out that the advanced countries have used discretionary fiscal policy, as Alfred has just explained, much more than emerging markets. We're seeing almost in terms of scarring, we're seeing the opposite, I think, of what we saw after the global financial crisis. My question, therefore, is for the countries, for national policies, does much more have to be done in fiscal policy, especially in India and other divergent countries, to finance the health emergency, where many countries like India are probably still in stage 1 of the health emergency, without worrying about the implications for medium-term public debt? That is the question I have. But therefore, looking ahead, the issue which we will discuss is, and Neil Higginson has done this intensely in the European Fiscal Board, the issue is how can fiscal policy change as we move through subsequent phases to drive the recovery, and which are the pillars of fiscal architecture, Alfred had just explained, that need to be put in place, at least to manage resources better and more transparently, and therefore to convince markets through these pillars of the commitment to sustainability. Those are my comments. Let me just end up my opening points by saying, in these historic times, as we look ahead, all this needs to be done in terms of fiscal policy with a medium term, while simultaneously, I presume, dealing with the climate change priorities that have now been addressed in the last 2 days. Vitor, can I please first turn to you to give us your sense, your experience, and your recommendations?
Thanks a lot, Anup. It's such a privilege to participate in this high-level roundtable with so many outstanding experts in the field. So I look forward to learning a lot from all of you. Alfred did an excellent job at giving the view of the fund concerning the current situation and prospects in India, in particular from a fiscal policy viewpoint. I agree with the points made by Alfred, and for the economy of time, I will try not to repeat. I will, however, cover the same ground from a slightly different perspective, and then I will try to zoom in on the importance of making progress in medium-term fiscal frameworks in India in the context of a concept for India's development going forward. Now, if you look at this slide, you basically see the link between a number of important macroeconomic indicators and fiscal policy. On the left-hand side, you have the path of real GDP for India. The upper line in black is the pre-COVID-19 projection. And then we have two projections in light purple at the bottom is what we were anticipating in the fall, and in darker purple, slightly up, is our latest. So you do see that the news has been good. The contraction in 2020, dramatic as it was less severe than feared in the fall. And the growth going forward has also been revised up so that the gap relative to the pre-COVID path is less than forecast previously for India. Still, there is a revision of the level of economic activity down towards the end of the forecasting period relative to pre-COVID, and that's what Alfred referred to as medium-term scarring. For the purpose of fiscal policy, India provides us with a very interesting case because our projections of output gaps for India pre-COVID-19 had the output gap relatively small at maximum alpha percentage point and closing in the medium term to zero. So we have a situation where India was projected to grow close to potential throughout the medium term, which from a conceptual viewpoint is a very clean counterfactual. We do see that in 2020, the output gap opened quite substantially, and that it is projected to close gradually over the medium term, although in 2024, which is the last year I portray here because we only had projections up to 2024 in the fall of 2019, which is our last full projection pre-COVID. And so you see that the output gap is still significant at the end. What you see on the right-hand side is that India does normally, according to historical patterns, respond relatively strongly to cyclical developments. That's in black, but in the face of COVID-19, the response was even stronger and, more importantly, more persistent than it would have been the case for a normal business cycle fluctuation. That is absolutely appropriate because COVID-19 is a health emergency, and so it is necessary to enable the health system. It is necessary to proceed with vaccination as fast as possible, and it is necessary to extend lifelines to vulnerable households and firms, and as, again, Alfred emphasized, avoid long-term scarring. What happens in the medium term? what you see in this slide is, again, exactly the same as we had before. The bottom panel this time is the public debt to GDP projection pre-COVID-19. You see a declining path. You do see in the chart a jump up in 2020. You see that the latest forecasts have revised slightly down the projection, but still the level of debt is substantially higher than was projected pre-COVID. The path is a declining path over the medium term, and you do see that in India, traditionally, the contribution of the snowball effect, the so-called R minus G, is negative and significant and reconciles a permanent primary deficit with a smoothly declining path of the public debt to GDP ratio. Now, it turns out that you could think that what I've shown you suggests that the current situation in India can continue forever. I would argue that even before COVID-19, there was a strong case for an upgrade in the medium-term fiscal framework in India to make it even more supportive of the Indian development strategy, and that the case for an upgrade of the medium-term fiscal framework has been made stronger by COVID-19 because the macroeconomic risks, as Alfred highlighted, but also the contingent liabilities associated with the risk, for example, of guarantees materializing, and the institutional risks have increased. That is associated with the heightened uncertainty from the pandemic and the need to keep fiscal policy agile and flexible, which is necessary for it to respond adequately to developments. Examples that we can give of areas where further progress can be made. The medium-term fiscal framework provides a framework for sound forecasting, and what you see here is that in the case of the forecast of revenues, India has a track record of substantial forecast errors and what seems to be a optimistic bias. So that does suggest that there is a room to improve when it comes to the forecasting element of the medium-term fiscal framework. Now, you can also think about medium-term fiscal frameworks as a way of providing ex-ante transparency and ex-post accountability. And if you look at that particular dimension, according to the Open Budget Survey, India ranks 49 out of 100, and so improving the quality of the information collected and disseminated in India seems also an area where it is possible to make further progress. It turns out that India is a continental power. It's a huge country. It's a very complex and lively federation. And so when one looks at the practices inside India, one does see that the standards in different areas of the country and at the various levels of the public administration are significantly different. So there is also room to improve there. Look, I didn't want to be exhaustive in any particular way. I don't regard the examples that I give as necessarily as priorities, but basically I want to submit to this roundtable that there are many areas where India can make progresses in the fiscal and financial frameworks, and by doing so can brighten substantially its prospects for long-term growth and its ability to avoid medium-term scarring. And I stop here, Anup.
Vito, thank you very much. I hope there's time to come back to the issues at the subnational level. But NK, can I please turn over to you and ask you to lead us forward?
Thank you very much, Anup, and thank you for the invitation to this distinguished panel. In Europe, we are not yet in a post.
Niels, I was just going to say, maybe we'll let NK speak first, and then we'll hear from you about Europe. So can I ask NK to go next?
Sorry?
Can I ask NK Singh to go next, and we'd ask you to come and speak after he does?
Oh, sorry.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Anup, and I'm indeed very privileged to be able to share some ideas and thoughts. May not necessarily be very symmetric and coherent, but to be in a panel with Montek, who is indeed the true 1991 reformer, along with Dr. Manmohan Singh, and with you, Anup, as not only given your valuable experience, but the way in which we worked as a team as part of the 15th Finance Commission. And let me acknowledge that huge support, Anup, on complex issues with which the 15th Finance Commission also grappled. And of course, Vito, it is always a singular pleasure to hear you because very few people speak with this kind of domain experience as you do. So it is indeed a great privilege for me to be part of this group. Alfred has made a brilliant presentation. I fully agree with Alfred's presentation. Vito, you have added some important dimensions to the sort of issues which are going to concern us in the medium term. And I want to respond to a few of those. Let me begin by saying that having chaired the last Fiscal Responsibility Management Committee, whose report was accepted in the budget of 2019, based on my report of 2017, which was an improvement on the earliest Fiscal Responsibility Management Committee of 2003. India was, in that sense, we have matured, thanks to the sort of encouragement given by the IMF, which I must acknowledge that since Montek was a leader, and along with Montek, both of us had negotiated those quarterly performance criteria while dealing with India's balance payments crisis of 1991, which we need to keep in mind. Notwithstanding those that particular learning curve which we had when dealing with the IMF, we did take a long time after 1991. We got out of the program in 93, but it took a long time to enact the first Fiscal Responsibility Management Committee, only in the year 2001 to be notified by the government in 2003. Now, the revision of that, which is contained in my report of 2017, accepted in 19, had, I think, 4 critical features. And I want to begin with that, then make a comment on that, and then make some suggestions. So what were these key features? One was that we moved away from a total dependence on fiscal deficit as the macroeconomic anchor to bringing in debt as a important macroeconomic anchor, and to give a certain disaggregated debt path over a medium term. So that was the first change, that fiscal deficit was the operational way of achieving the preferred levels of debt. As a recommendation, we said that given India's per capita income, given India's other advantages, but some disadvantages, an ideal debt to GDP ratio for a country of India's economic size for India as a whole would be in the region of 60% or so, and that a fiscal deficit target of about 3%, both by the center and then by the states, would enable us to reach this preferred debt trajectory by 24-25. So that is the baseline. We introduced numerous other important factors. We gave a framework for the triggering of escape clauses, which have been triggered by the government of 0.5% in our report, which could be triggered given a couple of contingent circumstances. And we also made certain recommendations on an institutional framework for the constitution of a fiscal council. Now, as we all know, that the report was accepted in its entirety, except this recommendation of the constitution of a fiscal council. And there seemed to be a great prevarication, if not a hesitation, on the part of the sovereign, that having bound themselves with the Monetary Policy Committee and having little room for flexibility on monetary policy, did not want to yield place to now constituting a fiscal council as well, circumscribing the maneuverability on key fiscal issues. So, but notwithstanding all this, we in the Finance Commission recognized, and this report of the Finance Commission, which of which Anup was a key player and has been mentioned also by Alfred in his presentation, has taken a leap of faith. We have made a medium-term projection of what would be India's fiscal deficit trajectory of the general government. And this is the point that Anup made very rightly, that I think that one of the infirmities of the Fiscal Responsibility Management Committee Act was really that a focus was too much on what the central government could do. But since the terms of reference of the 15th Finance Commission wanted us to do the debt trajectory and the fiscal deficit trajectory for the general government, which meant the federation as a whole, India and the subnational states. So taking that into account, we projected that there would be a trajectory of the overall fiscal deficit for both the union and the central government, which as a combined figure would reach a figure over a period of 5 years to end at 6.8% of the combined fiscal deficit of the union and the states, of which the union would be in the region of 4% and the states would be in the region of 2.8% or so, aggregating to that. And the debt picture for of the union as a whole would really, as far as the total liabilities are concerned, would begin to be in the region of 56% or so, comprising of 30% by the states and the balance by the union. So this was the overall framework in which we projected the 5-year picture on both the debt and the fiscal deficit of the general government. Now, I'm happy to be able to share that this was not only shared, it was accepted by the government, because in the medium-term fiscal policy statement, which is part of a mandatory FRBM statement, the finance minister, while presenting the budget on the 1st of February, accepted in entirety the projections and the issues raised by the Finance Commission as far as the states are concerned. But as far as the central government is concerned, instead of a terminal figure of 4% at the end of 25-26, they have ended that up by 4.5%, a 0.5% deviation from the target which we had given. In my view, not a very, very significant deviation, considering the fact that for reasons which we have discussed, the issues of the ongoing pandemic still pose us some very important issues. As we go forward, what do I regard as the 5 or 6 critical issues which still face us? I want to go back to that lovely chart that Alfred pointed out as far as India is concerned, the 3 pillars. The pillars of the fiscal rules, where in some ways we are in the 3rd phase of the fiscal rules, having done one earlier, and then the FRBM recommendation of 2003, and then the FRBM report of 2017. So the issues of the fiscal rules are still very much in public mind, even though we are in the 3rd phase. And I want to point out that I'm sure Anup, you would have noticed that the finance minister did in her budget speech, while referring to our report, mentioned that it was her intention to appoint another fiscal group to go into the medium-term fiscal framework in the light of the pandemic and the need for greater fiscal forbearance in the wage. So one is the issue of the medium-term fiscal rules themselves. The second is a broad issue on which Anup had done an enormous amount of work for the Finance Commission. I want to compliment him on the financial management process and systems, namely integrity of data, credibility of data. An important decision was made, I'm sure that Anup, you would have wanted to point out, that unlike in the past, when budgets normally ignored contingent liabilities, this is the first time that the finance minister recognized the need to take these contingent liabilities into account, and two very important aspects, namely the food subsidy and the borrowings from the small savings schemes, she has brought directly in the budget and recognized that these contingent liabilities must be added to the fiscal figures to get. But there is need for further refinement. There is need to further refinement not only as far as central government is concerned, on terms of the credibility of data, but more importantly, as far as the states are concerned, on the credibility of the contingent liabilities and guarantees of various kinds given. The third pillar on which still the jury is out is the issue of fiscal institutions. And anecdotally, if I might mention, Vito, this remained the most problematic area as far as my committee was concerned. So, to give you an example, not only the need for a fiscal institution, but embedded in it enforcement mechanisms of whatever the
NK, you're now on mute. You have to unmute yourself.
Did you lose? Did you lose out on a lot on what I said in the last 2 minutes or so?
No, it was more like 20 seconds.
Oh, 20 seconds, thank God. So I think that the issue of Vito on the issue of the credibility of fiscal institutions and enforcement mechanisms remain very, very problematic. And anecdotally, if I may mention, as we go forward, the political appetite for rule-based fiscal institutions is an area on which I think enormous work would need to be done. To give you, on a lighter side, a picture that we had a brilliant presentation by the World Bank, the managing director, of what happens when other countries which take on these obligations break the rule. He said, well, in the case of Peru, which I know very well, having broken the rule, the president had to resign. So I won't go that far, but certainly the issue of the enforcement systems and mechanism on fiscal institutions would remain problematic. Now, the last thing I want to say here before last 2 points, and then I will stop there. What we have done is, in our Finance Commission report, we have moved away from fixed points to giving fiscal range. We have given these ranges both for the union and for the states, in some way recognizing something that Montek had told me when I was working in the FRBM committee, that could you make many of this cyclically adjusted? So even though that proved problematic, the fact of recognizing a range instead of a fixed point, both for the union and the states, was one way of recognizing the need for cyclicality of behavior and to show a degree of flexibility when it comes to this. This is one point which I wanted to make. The second very major point, which given the issue of political appetite, right now, given the ongoing pandemic, for understandable reasons, talk of issues of fiscal policy will continue to occupy a somewhat backseat till such time as we have been able to get the better of this pandemic and we are able to reckon what it has cost in terms of the recovery process. By the way, if I may say so, Alfred, the Finance Commission's own projections on the likely path of the GDP behavior and nominal GDP and some of the other macro parameters are not very different than which the fund has also pointed out, and it is more or less kind of aligned. But as we go forward, there are new components of uncertainty which have been introduced. And I want to end this by just two very brief observations. Apart from fiscal institutions, on which enormous amount of work has to be done, these fiscal institutions would have to be replicated not only by the central government, but would have to be replicated by state governments. What is the kind of incentive mechanisms with which subnational governments can be incentivized for purposes of coming up with fiscal policies which are aligned to the policies of the central government? Now, we suggested a few. We have suggested, which have been accepted, of some latitude based on some sector reforms, particularly for the power sector and so on, but we need to do much greater thinking on that. The last comment which I want to make on this, given all these uncertainties, is the fact that I think there is a huge scope if India's medium-term fiscal policy can be aligned with something which is high on the priority of the political leadership right now. Highest on his priority, apart from dealing with the health and pandemic issues, and Anup was absolutely right that on the health much more needs to be done. There has been so far. The other issue on which there seems to be a high degree of convergence among the high levels of political strategy is the issue of global warming and climate change. Yesterday's speech of the Prime Minister in the special summit called by the US President really indicated India's high priority to attaching not only to meet the daunting challenges in terms of renewable energy, but embedded in it, it's a very forward step in recognizing the priority. So could there be some way, I asked myself the question, in which the framework for policies for COP26 could be aligned with India's medium-term fiscal policy framework, namely showing greater forbearance on debt and on fiscal deficit, provided expenditure patterns are in conformity with the expectations of what we want to do in COP26. And not only in terms of expenditure, but something which, Vito, you pointed out, which is of enormous significance while we focus on expenditure, is deep reforms of India's revenue system and revenue management systems. We have made a number of suggestions in the 15th Finance Commission's recommendations, which have broadly found sympathy, and not only redoing India's indirect tax, namely the GST, which we all know, and the fiscal and the GST Council manages that, but also in terms of the direct taxes. Because we agreed with the analysis of the fund that at least 4% of GDP is a lost potential in terms of India's revenue. And if some part of it could be realized, it would help greatly in aligning not only India's inevitable expenditure needs, pandemic needs, health needs, but find a convergence between sustainable development, which the leadership is committed to, and a medium-term fiscal policy statement embedded in the broad principles which constitute India's macroeconomic stability. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Anup.
Thank you very much, NK. You've raised so many issues. India is at the starting point of the implementation of your report. When we come to Montek, I'm going to ask him, what is the institutional way forward for India the next 5 years? But Niels Tegerson, please, we want to hear from you. You've studied all these issues at the European Fiscal Board, and what is your sense? It's very useful.
Thank you very much, Anup, and apologies for trying to intervene ahead of the Finance Commission President, whose very rich delivery convinced me that maybe some of the European experiences are even more relevant to India than I had thought. I take my point of departure, as he did, in the 3 points in Alfred Schipker's last graph, namely fiscal rules, institutions, and better public management. And I think I have something to say on all of these three, combining a bit the fiscal rules and institutions in the first part. Could I have the first slide on the screen, please? Yeah, the next one with text. Thank you very much. This is a timeline of the process that the European Union rather, has gone through in its efforts to reconcile, in a way, fiscal policy as a stabilizing instrument with a responsibility for medium-term planning and sustainability of public finances. We start from the post-war period. There was an enormous confidence that fiscal policy didn't need any constraints. It did very well, and the growth was so rapid for a long time. Revenues rose in step with even fast rising expenditures, that debt was kept at a low level, or it fell to 30% by around 1930 and right 1970. And that meant that there was great confidence in letting fiscal policy be a bit more centralized and even improving it further. But that was brought to an abrupt halt by the crisis of the 70s and 80s, when monetary and fiscal policy makers struggled to control their agenda in the face of new challenges, of supply shocks, of higher inflation. So for 15 years or so, public debt rose and fiscal policy didn't stabilize these economies. In the course of the 1980s and late 1980s in particular, a new emphasis came up in a way through monetary policy on longer-term commitments and emphasis on policy rules. Central banks were at least to become more transparent, also to make themselves more independent of short-term political pressures. But fiscal rules also became part of the agenda at that time. Finance ministers did see an advantage also in having some external pressure on their ability to control spending colleagues at home. And I remind you that the European Union maybe should be seen also in some sense as an analogy to India as a federal state with a number of rather divergent sub-federal units. So the Maastricht Treaty of 1991 did put a lot of emphasis on constraining fiscal policy and the long-term aspect. It was said in terms of the two rules that Mr. Singh also referred to from the Indian discussion, 3% deficit as a ceiling or reference value for the deficit, and a 60% norm for public debt as a reasonable level. That was more or less where the European Union was at the time, so it was not seen as very ambitious, simply saying we should stay more or less at this level of fiscal ambition. And it seemed to work not too badly for a couple of decades almost, until the financial crisis struck in 2008. By that time, there was a temporary suspension of the rules, but basically also the policy framework, emphasis on sustainability, survived, not very successfully, I should say, because public debt did not decline in that period very significantly. But anyway, the fiscal policy was somewhat under stressed in policy making. Let us look at what actually happened in Europe. The next slide, please. This is not a very proud picture of performance. You will see the rise of government debt on the left graph to a level now which is above that of India. It's 102% after the pandemic crisis, pushed up by another 15% or so. So very much higher than in the 1970, not to speak also of 1991 when the Maastricht Treaty was signed, and a source of concern, though that concern is eased very much at the present time by the apparent promise of relatively low interest rates and more active central bank purchases of debt in Europe. But it's a somewhat precarious balance still, and the debt level is high, and it's recognized that once the recovery from the pandemic crisis has occurred, there would have to be much more emphasis on reducing somewhat the very high level of average debt, and particularly in those countries that have the highest debt. Well, you can also look at the government deficit on the right. not a very good picture either, much higher than the 3% on average. And in particular now we are at 8% or so in 2020, but it's coming down rather fast because of the strength of automatic stabilizers. One more picture, please, the next slide. This is a complicated graph. I just wanted to look at one thing, the yellow line and the red dots that go along that yellow line. The yellow line is the rise in primary expenditures, that is apart from interest rates. Primary expenditures of governments, and the red dots are points of time when there was no output gap, when resources were fully used. And you will see that in the European context, fiscal policy was not particularly stabilizing. Expenditures continued to rise rather fast, even at times when there was full resource utilization. And this mixture of slippages much of the time, and then, of course, some major crisis, financial crisis, and now the pandemic crisis, has meant that the weighting again has to be reassessed between sustainability and a continued upward drift of government deficits. So let me turn to the next slide, which turns more to the institutional and the finance management procedures. Underpinning some of this European process has been a very useful, I think, more pedestrian process that also resembles some of the efforts that were mentioned in Mr. Singh's contribution. There's been a considerable strengthening of the budgetary process across the European continent. The role of the finance minister has been strengthened. The role of top-down planning has been strengthened. And the comparability of European budgetary data has been greatly improved through a general surveillance also from the European side. We had major problems with the quality of the data policy is based on at times in the past 2 decades. So now there's a much more narrow monitoring of that from the European institutions. We are avoiding the kind of misinformation that marred some of the reaction to the financial crisis in 2011-12, in the Greek case in particular. So data are more reliable. They are presented in a more comparable way. But the most important innovation is that of the growth of independent national fiscal councils, a decentralized feature of surveillance in Europe. I think one major motive was to protect macroeconomic forecasts on which budgets are based from political influence. There was an optimistic bias, in particular in the years prior to the financial crisis, which made countries, in a sense, slip into deficits too easily. And the one role of national fiscal councils is to, in a sense, monitor the quality of the macroeconomic forecast. They have improved significantly in recent years, maybe also for other reasons, but that is certainly one consequence. They have been less successful in their other role, which was to monitor the ability of governments or the willingness of governments to follow the rules, because there you get more into the kind of open political potential conflict between the fiscal council and the government in question. I don't think there was ever any very serious effect like what Mr. Singh mentioned of the consequences of the government not following the rules or the recommendations or the observations of national fiscal councils as to their compliance to the rules. All that was, in a sense, inherent in the European process was that if a government did something different from what the National Fiscal Council said, there should be a comply or explain process in place. But that part of the role of the fiscal councils is still somewhat weaker than the first one. It is developing, and there will be more emphasis in the future on the role of the councils in also assessing the medium-term outlook and longer-term sustainability. And finally, there is the whole process of commenting on the annual budgets that has been involved in the so-called European semester in the supranational context. and that is clearly where there's some analogy to how the federal government would look at what the states are doing. As I said, the current situation in Europe is that fiscal policy has been strongly expansionary to mitigate the attack of the pandemic crisis and to limit scarring. Fortunately, now forecasts are being revised upwards in Europe, and the projections of growth are approximately 4% for next year, for this year and for next year. So some of the output loss is being recaptured. But if one looks at the kind of graphs that Mr. Gasper was presenting, we are not catching up with the pre-pandemic growth. But one more thing is happening, and that also has a link to what Mr. Singh was saying. The crisis has fostered for the first time a more collective effort on the part of the European Union by setting up a common jointly financed mechanism for supporting investment in public expenditure with a growth-friendly orientation. And clearly, climate change investment comes up very high. That's been earmarked for a very high degree of the sums that are raised at the European level, and given to half, 50% approximately, in the form of grants to governments, so it doesn't immediately limit their capacity to take on other debt. So there's an element of the interplay of joint efforts and incentives for government to put higher priority on growth-enhancing expenditures. So my summing up of what the European experience is that it's an unfinished agenda in Europe, but the way to improve fiscal outcomes and give more weight to fiscal sustainability in the longer term is to improve transparency through the more pedestrian steps that I have just explained, but also to retain some measure of preferably numerical standards of behavior that are implemented also on the basis of some prior independent economic analysis. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tickerson. Your last slide, 5, very nicely complements and explains the chart on fiscal architecture in the Finance Commission. Montek, over to you. Just one point. I'm not sure how much time we'll have for a roundtable discussion. So let me pose you one question right away in your own comments. We're looking ahead the next 5 years. What about the institutional side? You have headed the Planning Commission and other institutions. What is the institutional structure India needs next 5 years? If we have a question for the many recommendations of the 15th Finance Commission, who do we ask? Over to you, Montek.
Thank you very much, Anup. And let me just begin by thanking both Rakesh and Alfred for inviting me to this very important, very interesting discussion, made all the more pleasant because it's really, at least on the Indian side, a gathering of old comrades in arms. As NK pointed out, I mean, he and I were colleagues together in the finance ministry during the times of the economic reforms. That's a really long time ago. But I mean, looking back, we've spent many, many years in government. The same thing is true of Rakesh Mohan. And of course, Anup, at that time on the IMF side. So it's nice to be with old friends together. You know, I mean, this has been a very rich discussion because the different panelists have covered a very wide range of ground. And maybe the best role I can play is to kind of range over this discussion, pick out a few things that struck me as being important. They may be disconnected, but perhaps they will help Rakesh, who is supposed to sum up, to pronounce on these issues. So I won't necessarily provide a good summary, but I give my views on things that I think have been discussed and which are important. Now, the first one, of course, is I want to agree with what NK said. You know, I share the view that in any sensible medium to long-term planning process, the fiscal health of the system has to be critical. But I also share his view that as the government is fighting a horrendous pandemic, which in the last few weeks seems to have got totally out of control, and quite frankly, none of us, certainly not me, expected that it would happen. The fact is that after September, things were kind of gradually improving. And then as the graph that Alfred put out showed, they really shot up. So at the moment, I don't think there's anyone in government worrying about fiscal deficits and fiscal institutions. And quite frankly, I wouldn't expect them to either. That's not to say, however, that experts shouldn't be worrying. I mean, we have to assume that somehow or the other, this pandemic will be brought under control. It's obviously going to take longer than many people thought, but it will be brought under control. And then we'll get on to the business of how does India try to recover ground in terms of the growth rates that it can expect. Now, looking at that perspective, I'm very struck by the fact that Alfred's projection of the IMF's expectations, that the IMF was more optimistic in April about India's growth than it was in October of 2020. This doesn't actually fit in with what I think is the current mood, because I think mood in October was actually quite optimistic, with basically many people thinking that they had become very pessimistic in the first quarter and were cheered by the fact that in the second quarter, although it was still negative, there was a rebound in output. So I think people expected that to actually continue. And to my mind, the projections that have been put forward by the IMF on growth rate in the coming year, I think reflect, they're probably dated in the sense that they reflect work done 2 or 3 months ago and do not fully reflect what the most recent surge might have done to the growth prospects. And I think that therefore a question has to be asked that if growth in the coming year, in the year, not the coming year, the year that's just begun, 21-22, if it's not going to be the 11.3 or whatever it is that the finance ministry was projecting, admittedly on the basis of an 8% decline, it could be significantly less than that. Then what does that imply for fiscal management in 21-22 itself? You know, a lot of people would say, and have said, that India did not use up the fiscal instrument quite as much as it could have in this difficult situation compared to what other countries did. Part of the problem is that in the previous year, the year that's just ended, 1920-21, the fiscal deficit that was shown was much higher than the budget estimate. And I think this reflected a very commendable decision by the finance minister to come clean on a number of items that were earlier hidden. Now that's good in the sense that if that is a commitment that will be built into fiscal accounting for the future, that will make the accounts much more transparent. But the increase in the fiscal deficit that took place doesn't reflect expansionary expenditure. It simply reflects a reclassification of expenditure. To the extent to which the government did not cut expenditure in the face of a big decline in revenues, both tax revenues and disinvestment revenues, I think that's also good. Because it would not have been the right thing to do to cut expenditures in an environment where the shock on production was being transmitted via income declines through a decline in both consumption and, quite frankly, also investment planning on the private sector side. So that part is also good. But it can be argued that given the impact on incomes of the poor, we didn't actually do as much as we should have. So this is one question that a lot of economists have raised. And I'm not raising it in order to ask the question, what should we have done last year? But it's very relevant in the coming year. Because if the growth is not going to be as high as was built into the projections, and if you're going to have kind of reflux of migrants who had begun to come back, going back into rural areas, the question arises whether in the current year, the government should perhaps tolerate a larger fiscal deficit than it had originally projected. Now, we don't have any mechanisms whereby governments revise their fiscal projections or even revise their growth projection. In fact, the only official estimate, official source of growth projections is the Reserve Bank of India, which is actually not the government of India, but it's the Reserve Bank of India. Their projection of growth is actually lower than what the finance ministry's projection was. So I think one of the issues we have to think about, whether in the year 21-22, the government should be willing to tolerate a higher fiscal deficit than it had itself projected in the budget estimates. I'm not actually, I mean, the IMF, to be honest, and Alfred, you should correct me if you think I'm being a little unnecessarily critical. I think the IMF has not been very clear on what its advice should be. Because the IMF has said that faced with this humongous pandemic, developing countries should be willing to spend more provided they have fiscal space. And of course, it's never clear who has fiscal space and who doesn't. Now, frankly, before the pandemic, if you had asked me, I suspect if you had asked NK or anybody, does India have fiscal space? I would have said no way. Because, you know, our general government deficit is more about twice what it is in the emerging market countries. But that's the pre-pandemic norm. The question is, if the pandemic is going to hit us for one more year, more than we thought, do we quickly go back to what we think is the norm, or do we take a more relaxed attitude? It's very connected with what NK said, that, you know, granting some leeway around the fiscal deficit. I would be inclined to say that they should benefit from that. They should take up that advice and not mind using that if it turns out that we are more hit by the second surge than earlier looked likely. And also, in this environment, it's quite possible that some of the disinvestment returns that were expected may not materialize. Now, I'm very clear in my mind that if they don't materialize, should we cut down expenditures to keep to the fiscal deficit in the budget? I would say no. We allow the debt, as a result, of course, the public debt would be higher. It would put more pressure on us in the medium term, bring in a sensible fiscal correction. I mean, I say this also in the context that, you know, traditionally, the short-term concern with the fiscal deficit has been the possibility of crowding out. But quite honestly, if the growth rate is not going to be what the IMF has projected, and it sort of sputters out, one of the problems in that context is that a lot of the high growth that gets recorded is a reflection of what's happening in the formal sector. It's true that listed company data, etc., show that revenues have gone up. Actually, they show that profits have gone up even more, which actually suggests that they're cutting costs, getting rid of contract labor. So on the income side, while profits are going up, on the income side, labor incomes are going down. And that would have spin-off effects on the rest of the informal sector, which we're not actually able to capture. I mean, the current method of measuring GDP is to assume that growth in the informal sector will be what it is in the formal sector. But I think that what the pandemic is doing is creating an environment in which the formal sector is going to be able to grow much more rapidly, and the informal sector will not. Some of this is due to the formalization of the economy, which is actually being helped by tax reforms, digitalization, etc. But I think if we are not reflecting the fact that the informal sector may not be growing that rapidly, we may be overestimating the growth of GDP. Now, this is I'm only throwing in considerations which I hope that those in government and those in think tanks, etc., can make more concrete, so that this time around the finance minister, well into the middle of the year, by June of this year, should have a pretty good idea of what the prospects are, so that in their planning, they can actually modify the fiscal strategy, take advantage of the flexibilities that the NK Singh committee has recommended, and sort of do the right thing. Now, let me come to the last point, and that is institution building. I mean, there are two aspects to this. One is, would the Fiscal Council help? My view has always been that the Fiscal Council is a good idea. Essentially, it would create an independent way of people to know what the state of the fiscal position is. It would prevent kind of data from being massaged too much, etc. But whether that would help very much is another issue altogether. Because I think fiscal councils and intelligent debate on the fiscal deficit, I mean, these things have an impact if Parliament wants to debate these things and actually exert a discipline. Now, I fear that in our case, I mean, we just stopped being a low-income country. So I've often said to friends of mine who hope to become finance ministers that, whatever their economic training, they can be sure that if they stand up as a finance minister and announce a cut in tax revenues and an increase in expenditure, it will be met with round applause. And as NK said, there are no built-in penalties. I mean, forget about the president resigning. By the way, the president resigning in India, since we are not a presidential system, would be no cost at all. But even the finance minister doesn't have to resign. The only implication of busting the fiscal rule is that you have to tell Parliament that I'm afraid we had to bust it. I don't think that they had any problem. I mean, if you could go before Parliament and say, keeping in mind the interest of the country, the interest of the poor, the interest of macro stability, etc., I'm departing from the earlier fiscal deficit, and this will actually lead to much better growth and higher employment. I mean, everybody would applaud. So we don't yet have a political environment, quite frankly, in which the fiscal deficit is something that people need to worry about. This is my first point. The second point is really, what about the medium term? And I think and I think NK mentioned quite rightly, climate change. I think in the medium term, there's a lot of things we are announcing, and we should announce. I mean, it's a no-brainer that in the kind of world we're moving towards, there's going to be a built-in increase in inequality. Some of which will be very specific to India, some of which is general across the board. And I think in the recovery also, the phenomenon of scarring, which will prevent certain sections of the economy from actually recovering rapidly, will itself create, at least for some time, income inequality, and that will create a lot of social pressure to do something. Now, the common, I think even the IMF, in the recommendations it makes, says that you should do more on health, you should do more on social services and social security, you should certainly do more on education, including education for women. We have to do a lot more on infrastructure, which is green. We need to accelerate the building of green infrastructure so that we don't get tied up with old infrastructure. Now, all of this is going to cost a lot of money. In the old days, there was a sort of assumption that merely by going public-private partnership, and I think both, well, Rakesh and NK and I at different times have endorsed this approach. But, you know, while I think we were right to do so, and I think India has demonstrated that, you know, you can have very good private infrastructure. But the idea that in the middle of a pandemic, with the corporate sector deeply scarred, huge debt being incurred, that you're going to be able to do it is, to my mind, not very credible. The alternative, of course, is to do a lot more public infrastructure and then sell it off after you've built it. By when perhaps people will be in a position to judge more accurately how the economy is proceeding. But, you know, all of this means making sure that we know what we want to spend, adding it all up, translating that into a fiscal projection, and then asking the question, how do we finance it? Now, my guess is that, you know, there's no question that over a medium term, there has to be a major increase in tax revenues as a percent of GDP, which brings in the whole issue of tax reform. And quite frankly, there has to be a major reduction in hidden subsidies. I mean, for example, we can't seriously talk about climate change and continue to have hidden fossil fuel subsidies, electricity subsidies, etc. But we have seen that although economists and indeed different governments happily endorse this, the truth is, and the decision on getting rid of electricity subsidies doesn't rest with the central government. It actually rests with the state government. To my mind, there's no state government that actually realizes at the moment that this is something that they cannot avoid. Now, I assume, I don't know exactly what the Niti Aayog, we've abolished the Planning Commission, and that's fine. But this job needs to be done. It was always my view that the Planning Commission, by trying to plan every sector, was making a mistake. But we should be concentrating on 5 or 6 things. And I think those are the same things which could be done now. Now, whether it's done by a special arrangement, the Niti Aayog, this I have no, I mean, it doesn't matter. But somebody should be responsible for doing it. Today, because we've abolished plans, we have no way of knowing what is the total expenditure that's going to be incurred on health and how much of that is public and private over the next 5 years. What's the total expenditure on education? What's the total expenditure on research and development? What's the total expenditure on infrastructure and so on? And I think you cannot form a medium-term sensible assessment of India's fiscal strategy without knowing what these totals will be. I mean, for example, if it is really your belief that all this can be done by the private sector, it need not have much of an impact on the fiscal deficit. But if you want to have a more reasonable approach, then I think the arithmetic works out to something like the following. The general government deficit probably has to come down by at least 4 percentage points of GDP. That's actually conservative. Many people would have said 5 percentage points of GDP, general government deficit. In addition to that, we probably need to add at least 1% of GDP to education, perhaps 1.5% of GDP to health expenditure, another 1% of GDP, public, to infrastructure, and almost certainly, given the geopolitical situation, we will have to add at least 0.5% of GDP to defense. So if you add these things up, and also R&D, because quite honestly, a lot of what we're trying to do, particularly on agriculture, countering climate change, etc., is going to require a lot of government support of R&D in agriculture. Now, if you add this all up, we're talking about a fiscal turnaround of 10 percentage points. Now, this can only happen if you get an increase in tax revenues to GDP of something of the order of 6 percentage points, and a reduction in expenditures, mainly in dysfunctional subsidies, but a few others, something like 4 percentage points. Now, we need a 6 or 7 year plan to achieve this, and we do not have at the moment any institutional mechanism that would do it. Now, quite honestly, it's not as if the Planning Commission was always able to make these tough choices, but in those days, it was always felt that a little bit of improvement would go a long way. But I think we've run out of that. What we're now talking about is that we need a pretty systematic improvement, which somebody or the other needs to work out what it implies. So with those words, let me thank you for inviting me to this, and also to request the organizers that the slides that have been presented, they were all mucked up by our own pictures intruding. So could you send them to us separately afterwards? Because I think they were very good. Thanks very much. Thank you, Rakesh.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, but before I turn to Rakesh to try and sum up, can I ask Vitor to give us his points? Maybe how do we deal with all this uncertainty in forecasting fiscal policy? And maybe NK has a point to make before I turn to Rakesh. Vitor, to you first.
Thanks, Anup. I will try to be telegraphic. Montec did raise the issue of uncertainty and the forecasts of the IMF. We have indeed very much stressed the fact that in times of the pandemic, the forecast is highly uncertain, and that uncertainty is something that we have to take into account in the conduct of fiscal policy, maintaining an agile and flexible attitude so that fiscal policy can respond to the pandemic. I think, Montec, that you were making that point yourself quite emphatically. I fully agree. But at the same time, we are now emphasizing that it's very important that the prospects for fiscal policy in the medium to long run be assessed systematically in a very transparent way, so that the trade-offs between the short run, the medium term, and the long run can be well understood for all involved. Now, I would very much argue against relaxed attitude. You did use, Montec, the expression a relaxed attitude. I don't think that you meant it. I think that we have understood in India and other countries that complementarities between monetary and fiscal policy during the period of the pandemic increase fiscal space. You made that point, and that's spot on. But that complementarity will not last forever. And so it's very important to have at the same time a medium and long-term perspective, so that we have the right lighthouse that to guide us in exiting COVID-19 and make a transition to an economy which will be hopefully greener, as you all emphasized. I will stop here.
Thank you. So, NK, do you want to say anything more before I turn to Rakesh? You're still, I think, muted.
No, thank you, Anup. I have said enough, but I'll just make two very short. First, I agree with Vito that I don't think Montec quite meant a totally relaxed attitude, which in total disregard of the key components of overall stable macroeconomic framework. But I think that he was more emphasizing the current uncertainties, which make this kind of a stance problematic. So that's my first point. Second, on a lighter vein, can I say that Montec, in trying to understand the average psyche of Indian Parliament and the average psyche of a persistent belief that enhanced public outlay is central even in normal times, for purposes of growth, makes the entire legislative parliamentary wing impervious to these complex issues that we have been discussing. And one of the things that my big worry was for 6 years when I was in the upper house to share with you, Vito, that whenever I raised the issue with the presiding officer, that can we discuss perhaps one day at least the upper house of parliament can discuss the 5-year plan. They said, yes, of course, it's very important, but that day never came. And if I had raised the issue of saying fiscal policy, if ever I used, the two members sitting next to me, one continues to be a very important leader of the CPM party. Alas, he lost his son, and my compliments, Sitaram Yechuri. The moment I would use the word fiscal, he would say that is an IMF type of language which we expect for NK to speak. But we don't understand, because at any point in time, Montek did correct that if the finance minister would get up and say, you know, colleagues and friends, we have an FRBM Act, but don't you think that we should say relax this in the interest of roads investment, drinking water, piped water? Yes, of course we should do that, and to signal that as a triumphant approval of Parliament to the relaxation from the fiscal rule was something which I agree will require much greater engagement, involvement, education of parliamentarians. To begin with, my suggestion would be that if the Standing Committee of Finance of Parliament could devote some time to this, because the Standing Committee, unlike the Parliament as a whole, which consists of both the upper and the lower house, has right now a very exceedingly sensible person who understands all this. I think that will be a step forward in terms of greater engagement, greater education, and enhanced consciousness. But alas, not now. Alas, at the moment, the issue is how do we really deal and navigate against this unexpected pandemic second wave which has hit us. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. I will turn it over to Rakesh to give us his thoughts and his concluding remarks. We haven't talked about it a lot yet, but I think, Alfred, we will need another discussion sometime in the future, at least on the third tier and the states and how we put them together in health and education. Now over to you, Rakesh, please.
Thank you very much, Anup, and thanks to all the speakers. I am not going to make any attempt whatsoever to try and summarize. I want to just make one, I think, key point, which I think suffuses everything else, and that is really where Montek ended, which is, which also NK mentioned, of course, which is that according to the Finance Commission's calculation, we are about 4% of GDP below our tax potential. That's a lot, in that it's about 25% of the total taxes collected, center and states combined. And to my mind, that is the key issue, pervading everything that was discussed today. And what is not mentioned is that our tax GDP ratio has been rock solid for 12 years, with around 6% real annual GDP growth on average over those 12 years. So this is something extremely unusual. I have not seen, including places from like my institution, really studies, really understand why this is the case. It's highly unusual in terms of having zero buoyancy of tax revenues with this kind of a consistent income increase as we have indeed fortunately experienced. Now, Montek mentioned this, but the point there really is that with this kind of tax GDP ratio constancy, the chance of having fiscal rules, fiscal institutions is zero, because there is the constant pressure of the kinds of issues that NK mentioned, Montek mentioned, that given our country pressures for expenditure on all the items that we've mentioned are so heavy that there is, with zero tax buoyancy, there's no way that any parliamentarians, a country as a whole, is going to accept, and I think NK was describing the mood much better in some, because he's been there in Parliament, would have any truck whatsoever. So I do think that in terms of work that we need to do, both in research institutions, the IMF, etc., is to really try and understand, because we've had really very fine tax reforms for 30 years. From the kind of mess that we were in 1990 to where we are today, where we have a streamlined GST. Of course, we can improve on the GST. The income tax reforms you had, both personal and corporate. In my personal view, I think we made a major error in terms of reducing the corporate tax. It won't have any effect, in my view, on the behavior of corporates. And I welcome Mr. Biden's move to try and get minimum corporate tax across the world, although I don't think that's going to happen. Now, again, as Montek mentioned, we do need something like 1% extra, 1% of GDP extra on health, at least 1.5% probably, on education, on infrastructure, and also climate change. He mentioned climate change a lot earlier, but then he didn't mention that in the expenditure in addition to these expenditures. One thing I think that I'm not fully in agreement with Montek is that actually there's very little wiggle room on the expenditure side. Given the absolutely committed expenditures on salaries and pensions, of course, pensions will go down because we moved to a different system now. But the point is that by any reckoning, despite popular opinion and impression, the government of India at all levels, central government, state governments, and local governments, are actually too small. This is an unpopular thing to say, particularly in IMF audience. But it is the case with all the data that one can put in hand. Second, as I said, salaries, pensions, debt payments, hopefully will come down from the increased debt payment that has happened now, but it'll remain very significant. So there's not much wiggle room there. Defense, as Montek said, we probably need to spend more given the geopolitics of the world today. Subsidies, yes, I think that's the only place where there's room for reduction. And in some sense, my view is that it's very difficult to reduce subsidies less than 1% of GDP. But there is much higher than that, and we can have it much more directed. So my general point, as I'm saying, is one more point, if I may make, having been, I just noticed I'm the only fellow here who's worked on both sides of 19th Street in DC, also in the finance ministry here and the central bank here and the planning commission actually. So I'm the only fellow who's worked in all these institutions. So let me just say one word on financial repression. That one of the consequences of the fiscal problem that we have continuously is indeed huge fiscal repression, financial repression. And that pervades all kinds of problems in the financial sector as a whole. So I'll just conclude by saying that, look, the key problem really is to try and understand, despite in some sense the finest tax reforms, everything in some sense the IMF has been recommending for 30 years, we've done. There could be some improvements, but in principle we've done them. The question is, why is there no buoyancy? Why is it a compliance problem, or what is it? So I'll just end with that, and to just do my job as a president of the Center for Social and Economic Progress. We were Brookings India until September of last year. Thank you all very much indeed. Vito, Alfred from the IMF to do this with us. We feel really honored. We feel really honored that we had such a high level of representation from Europe, from Mr. Tigerson, if I'm pronouncing your name properly. I did spend 2 months in Denmark working on a farm in 1965, so I think I pronounced it correctly. And everyone else, all the technical team actually, worked very hard indeed, both in the IMF and in CSEP. And of course, finally, the speakers, in addition to Mr. Tigerson, that is Alfred himself, Vito, NK, Montek, and the deputy director of fiscal, my apologies, Anne-Marie Gould-Wolf, for having participated and having had such a marvelous session. And as Anup said, let's hope we can do this again and delve more into the issue, particularly, of course, the issue that I mentioned. Thank you very much, all.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.